Good evening, everyone. Great crowd this evening. Welcome to the National Building Museum. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President for Education here at the museum. And tonight we present a program entitled Historic Preservation versus Sustainability, ? As part of our series For the Greener Good, Conversations That Will Change the World. Over the last several years, much attention has been given to new construction of sustainable buildings. However, these only represent a small portion of the existing building stock that we have around us. And when you consider the embodied energy that goes into construction, often the greenest buildings are the ones that were already built, to quote Dick Moe. The discussion tonight will explore how communities can balance the historic fabric of vernacular architecture with greener buildings. And really, that's a false choice, because I think we'd all agree that we can have both. We've assembled quite an impressive array of panelists today, and I look forward to an in-depth and fascinating talk. Two quick program notes before we begin. On April 7th, the museum will present the 2011 Charles Atherton Memorial Lecture with Danish architect and planner Jan Gehl. Jan will discuss his work making cities such as New York, Guangzhou, China, and Melbourne, Australia greener. And he'll spend the bulk of his time talking about recommendations on how to make the capital city here in Washington, D.C. a more sustainable, walkable, and healthier city. So that should be a fantastic talk. And on April 18th, we will conclude this year's season of For the Greener Good with a panel exploring passive house technology. These tightly sealed and hyper-energy efficient buildings are being constructed throughout Europe, actually being mandated in some cases throughout Europe. Will this be the future of housing in the United States? What can we learn from their experience? And finally, before we get into the introductions, for the third time this season, we are live tweeting tonight. Slowly embracing the 21st century. The hashtag is #FGG. We encourage you to chime in to the conversation, ask a question. I understand we've already received our first question, so thank you to whoever's out there. I'll also be coming around with a microphone too. So, the For the Greener Good series is presented by the museum's sustainability partner, the Home Depot Foundation, and we would like to thank them for their generous support of this innovative lecture series. And programs such as tonight, many of you I'm sure have been to our past For the Greener Good programs, have been designed to engage with all of you. They're designed to be conversations in format. So we're going to break periodically for Q&A from the audience. And to give the audience an idea of who is out there, who it is that they're speaking to, can we get a sense of some of the different folks that might be out there? Raise your hands if you are architects. Great. Planners. Great, a lot of planners tonight. Landscape architects, wonderful. Engineers, wonderful, thank you. Students, that's great. Federal or state employees, you can raise your hand more than once. Educators, boy, that's great. Thank you, that's really helpful to give the audience an idea of who they're speaking to. What's that? And we're all historic preservationists. Thank you very much. See, this is part of and historic preservationists. See, we're beginning this conversational format even before the program begins. That's what I love about this audience. So let me give a brief introduction to each of our panelists so we can go ahead and begin the conversation. The one program note, we found out just today that Anna Dyson is unable to join us as she is under the weather. But we have an amazing group of three panelists and our moderator. I will begin, I'll do this alphabetically. Maria Casarella is an associate with Cunningham Quill Architects and has over 15 years of award-winning residential, institutional, and historic preservation experience as an architect practicing right here in Washington, D.C. She takes a context-based and site-specific approach to architecture, promoting an organic design process that takes into account the unique sensibilities of both her clients and projects. She is active in the Washington, D.C. community and has been on the board, has been a board member of the Cleveland Park Historical Society. She was appointed by Mayor Adrian Fenty to the District of Columbia Historic Preservation Review Board in 2008. She is the chair of the Sustainability Committee of the HBRB and is leading the effort to revise the D.C. Historic Preservation Guidelines to address green building practices. Eleni Reed serves as the Chief Greening Officer at the U.S. General Services Administration Public Building Service. She joined GSA on June 7th, 2010. She leads their Green Proving Ground program designed to use GSA's inventory of buildings as a test bed for innovative green building technologies and operational practices, share results with federal agencies and the commercial real estate industry, and help lead market transformation. She also heads a National Sustainability Council tasked with the implementation of sustainability practices across their business lines and regions to meet the agency's commitments under the Federal Leadership in Energy, Environmental, and Economic Performance Executive Order. Prior to coming to GSA, she was the Director of Sustainable Strategies with the Cushman & Wakefield's Client Solution Group. She led the effort to enhance the environmental performance of the firm's portfolio of U.S. managed properties. Her prior public service includes working with the City of New York, the City of New York's Mayor's Office of Operations, where she led the implementation of the city's Green Building Standards Law and served on the Mayor's Task Force on Sustainability. Brendan Owens is USGBC's Vice President of Lead Technical Development. In this role, he collaborates with volunteer technical committees to continue the evolution of USGBC's Lead Green Building Rating System. During his almost 9 years at USGBC, and I just found out he was the 11th employee at USGBC, quite impressive since they have only over 200 people now. During his almost 9 years at USGBC, he has led development activities for numerous LEED rating systems, including the most recent LEED 2009 technical updates. He is a delegate to the United Nations Environmental Programme Sustainable Buildings and Constructives Initiative, think tank on benchmarking sustainable buildings, and represents USGBC on the Executive Committee for Standard 189.1. He is also on the Board of Directors for the New Buildings Institute. Prior to joining USGBC, he worked designing, implementing, and verifying performance contract-based energy conservation products in existing buildings. He's a LEED accredited professional and a licensed professional engineer. And our moderator tonight is the museum's own Martin Moeller. Martin Moeller is Senior Vice President and Curator here at the National Building Museum. While with the museum, he served as the lead curator for various exhibitions, including Liquid Stone, New Architecture in Concrete, and Reinventing the Globe, a Shakespearean theater for the 21st century. He is currently developing an amazing exhibition called Unbuilt Washington, scheduled to open at the end of this year. Working independently, he wrote the 4th edition of the AIA Guide to the Architecture of Washington, D.C., published in 2006, and is now working on the next edition, on the 5th edition, and the manuscript for which is due next week. Before joining the National Building Museum in 1998, Martin served as Executive Director of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Martin.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks for everyone for being here tonight. We're going to try to have a pretty freewheeling discussion. I do want to begin with a couple of directed questions to the panelists, but then otherwise we're going to just sort of open up generally for discussion. As Scott said, I think it's probably fair to say that there's probably no one in this room who thinks that either sustainability or preservation is a bad idea. And I would hope everybody agrees that these are things that can go hand in hand. But there are issues. There are questions of balance and prioritization and juggling of lots of different considerations. And that's what we hope to address tonight, that will help people come away with some tools for understanding strategies that will help us find the appropriate balance between preservation and sustainability. So with that, we have a representative of the largest landlord in the galaxy, I think, the General Services Administration. So Eleni, if you could talk a bit about GSA's efforts to retrofit buildings, to deal with your existing building stock, particularly with an eye towards sustainability, and as that relates to questions of historic value and cultural value.
Sure. Just to correct that, DOD surpasses us by far. So at GSA, we're very much focused in reinvesting in our existing inventory. As you may know, GSA was the beneficiary of a substantial amount of funding under the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And we, as a result of this funding, were able to invest significantly in our portfolio, and that really enabled us to tackle our existing portfolio, looking at how we can transform the buildings that we currently have in our inventory into high-performance green buildings. So we were able, with this effort, to touch on approximately 100 buildings that we consider historic, whether they be legacy buildings or of historic value. So that's been a tremendous effort that we've been working on over the last couple of years. A lot of these projects were major modernizations and renovations. With regards to how that applies to our view on historic preservation, I mean, in our mind, our investments in our portfolio and our historic buildings are inherently sustainable. We invest in our building stock, and we view that preservation and environmental efficiency, in fact, operate hand in hand.
Brendan, could you talk a bit about the development of LEED for existing buildings and how that's coming on board in terms of its relationship to the original LEED standards, how you see that changing the operations of USGBC in the future, and how you think that's going to change how we go about preserving existing buildings?
So how many of you are LEED accredited professionals? Oh, great. Wow. How many of you spend most of your time looking at the design and construction, new construction LEED rating systems of the ones who are LEED APs? So it seems like it was equal numbers. In terms of the work that we've done to sort of define green building on the design and construction side over the last 11 years, the birthday for LEED's coming up next month, the focus has been on the continuum of the built environment. And when we've started with the initial rating system, it was really about design and construction of new buildings. But very shortly after we launched the new construction rating system into the market, we started on a rating system that was focused on building operations and maintenance. And I guess the best way to describe it is to use an analogy of a Prius sitting on a dealer's lot. You walk up to the Prius and you look at the sticker on the window and you look at the potential of that by looking at the projected gas mileage. But in reality, that car is going to operate similar to a building, how it would operate. If you pay attention, if you drive like a hypermiler, you're going to get that performance and potentially even better. But in reality, if you drive it, sometimes like I drive it like you stole it, it's gonna perform significantly worse. And from the standpoint of the difference between the way that LEED for existing buildings has arrived, we're still looking at the same main tenets of green buildings. So we're looking at location, looking at sites, we're looking at water, materials, energy, and the indoor environment. But we're looking at those issues through an operational and a performance lens. So the analogy here is that we are looking at the dashboard of the Prius, and we're actually looking at how effective you are at operating that building to its potential. I am an existing buildings background guy, and existing buildings is kind of where I came up. So I've always felt that, and buildings that are on paper don't actually use any energy, so there's not much to save there. So the real opportunity for completing the mission of USGBC is in the built environment, and our existing buildings program is focused on that operational lifespan of a building, and it's been a really wonderful experiment for us, and I think that it's growing and growing and growing, and we're going to see, and have seen actually, LEED for existing buildings become a more important in terms of growth program than our new construction rating systems are currently.
Maria, from your perspective, both as a practicing architect and a member of the Historic Preservation Review Board, what sort of things do you see going on locally in terms of the balance between preservation and sustainability, and how is that affecting your work, particularly in terms of historic preservation review?
Well, I'd like to see a lot more communication between the efforts. DC has made tremendous efforts on their agenda with sustainability through the planning process and through regulation and laws. But on the preservation side, I think we're just starting that conversation perhaps a little late in the game to engage the preservation community to be a part of that conversation. On the board now, we're rewriting the guidelines to address technical issues related to sustainability and give homeowners more information, more resources. There haven't been any specific conflicts in regards to both those issues. Certainly before the board, we've had projects that address sustainability with different technologies, and I think I agree with Scott's first statement that it's not a choice, it's a false choice to pit against each other. Continuing with the Prius theme, I think from my experience, LEED for existing buildings certainly could go a lot further to quantify what we see as the cultural value of existing buildings. It's something very hard to quantify, I know, and you can certainly look at bricks and give them a value in certain points of view, but from the preservation point of view, from the architectural point of view, it's sort of quantifying the Tesla versus the Prius, perhaps, and does that have a greater meaning and significance? How does that affect the entire community, and how do you quantify that? So I think that's the conversation that the sustainable preservation people like to bring into the whole LEED rating system and the conversation about sustainability.
In terms of, we had a sort of an informal conversation before we came down here for the session, and I think an interesting point that you made, Brendan, was that you see potentially now for LEED for existing buildings to begin to help people assign value to historic buildings that might have been difficult for them to appreciate before. Can you talk a bit about that point and how that's maybe changing attitudes towards historic preservation?
I think the thing that spurred that particular, I think the comment that we're talking about, it was a discussion of energy use disclosure ordinances that are popping up all over the country. So cities like DC and San Francisco and Seattle and New York are putting in place requirements for commercial buildings over a certain number of square feet, even if they're privately owned, to disclose their energy use. And one of the things that we kind of inherently know about the way that buildings work is that buildings that are older tend to, older by in the 80, 90, 100-year-old range, tend to outperform newer buildings in terms of energy use. And from that standpoint, I mean, there's plenty of studies that we can point to that say that. And it's sometimes surprising that the brand new, shiny, all-glass building across the street isn't performing as well as the well-massed, well-oriented, well-shaded building that has been there for 125 years. Sometimes not. But in terms of sometimes you talk to commercial real estate people and they don't know that fact. So the reality is that as those utility disclosure ordinances start to occur, I think what they're going to start to see is that the buildings that are the dogs are the buildings that are the more sophisticated, technically sophisticated buildings, and the ones that are really the Energy Star performers are going to be the older buildings. And from the standpoint of the building valuation, I think that it's going to increase the attractiveness of these buildings as assets, because when you start looking at serious accounting of a carbon footprint of an organization, buildings tend to be a dominant factor in a lot of what's going on there, building energy use in particular, and transport related to buildings as well. So from that standpoint, I think that there's a real potential for some of the newer regulations to highlight the benefits of old buildings, historic buildings that are quantifiable today in a way that they're not currently being quantified or not highlighted as.
I think one of the important issues as well about whether it's LEED for existing buildings or other mechanisms, it's really about how you track building performance. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really of importance to us at GSA as we either construct new buildings or do major alterations. We really want to make sure that as a result of that, we're actually tracking performance and making sure that the buildings are performing per their design. And I think LEED for existing buildings is it's a tool that we can use as we have buildings that transition after a new construction certification to really then go back and take a look. Are the systems functioning as designed? How are we tracking energy, water, and waste, and indoor environmental quality? And that's an important factor for us, especially as we look at our assets and we're holding them for the long term. We really want to make sure that they're performing as optimally as possible. The other thing I wanted to add to the value conversation is that I think there's a lot of discussion in the marketplace around how you, in the appraisal community, about how you actually value higher performing buildings, and there's certain parts of efficiency that are perhaps easier to value, and that usually turns around energy efficiency and commissioning and things that are easier to actually get numbers on. So I think that's evolving over time as well. But there's also this nuance between the high performing, green buildings versus perhaps the less energy efficient browner buildings, and we're starting to see some of that discourse happen in the marketplace.
Picking up on something that Maria suggested, that maybe the historic preservation community, I hate that term, makes it sound like it's one easily defined lump of people, but the historic preservation minded people maybe haven't gotten on board with this as sort of key proponents of sustainability perhaps as much as might be worthwhile. How could that happen more effectively? How could these groups begin to work together and serve each other's ends at the same time?
I think certainly at the national level it's happening. There's a real leadership with the National Trust and the Sustainability Coalition that they've put together, various groups, and they're working, I know, directly with you on issues in terms of measuring cradle-to-cradle statistics, life cycle analysis metrics that can start to address not just performance, but the value of recyclability in an element of a building. So I think at the national level, that's really taking place. Locally, I don't see it as much in my practice and in my experience on the board, and I think certainly one of my roles as a board member is to create outreach and education opportunities for that, to sort of join groups together that traditionally may have not been together. DC is a very small town. I think many of you know that. So there are people that have been active in the preservation community that maybe aren't talking to the people that are really active in the sustainability issues of the district. So I see that as really an outreach and education issue, not necessarily that they don't want to be together.
I think we tend to talk past each other sometimes too, and in reality I should have probably tracked it from the beginning, but I probably in the high dozens of emails that I've gotten from the historic preservation community, I will lump them in, basically saying, look, there's no credit in LEED for historic preservation. And the way that we go about valuing the existing buildings, old buildings, historic buildings, is entirely different than just pointing them out as historic and saying that's good enough. What we've done in LEED is value the things that are inherent in the nature of existing buildings, in historic buildings. Value density, value community fabric, value the fact that the building is already there, that you're not digging up a new resource in order to put a new building there. And when you look at the new construction rating system on the 2009 version, almost 25% of the total of the base points are awarded to things that historic buildings, when they're going through major renovations, would achieve just by nature of the fact that they exist. So they're inherent qualities, but that is a more difficult story than just to say it's historic, you get this many points. So I think that there's an education gap that exists between the way that particularly USGBC and green building rating systems more generally across the globe value the aspects that are embodied in historic buildings and maybe more importantly historic communities as part of the fabric of a city. And I think that we can do a better job of making sure that we're having at least conversations using the same language.
It seems that the major point of overlap of preservation and sustainability is ultimately the issue of life cycle. And it's something that, particularly in this country, we're not especially well versed in dealing with, and there's a tendency to look at initial costs, at initial issues, and not to conceive of things more holistically. How do you begin to get all of the players involved in the life cycle of a building to understand that and to work together, either at a large organization or through regulatory or policy issues, or through practice and through review? Maybe you can talk about
Sure.
the operations and maintenance aspects of your buildings and how those people are being brought into this.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's really important for us is that we hold specifically our historic assets for a long period of time. So it's very important to us to, when we make investments in our properties, when we reinvest in the properties, to think about the longer term and therefore looking at the life cycle costs of our investments. So looking at a longer period of time within which we can make the determination that this particular material or approach is worthwhile pursuing. So I think that is something that we're developing tools around. We currently have a tool that we're developing or that we're using now with our designers around windows. So it's helping us evaluate life cycle issues and make sure that we're looking at durability and payback periods and the length of the sort of life cycle issues on the same page. We also have to work with design teams that understand this. So we do have to educate both the A&E firms that we're working with, as well as make sure that our project managers understand that internally as well.
Here, chime in.
So, in terms of, quantifying the life cycle value, one way to look at LEED and one way to look at the point structure in the rating system is to say that we're valuing, things like recycled content and all the new stuff. Another way to look at it is that we are, in fact, in some instances, putting new buildings at a deficit. We're basically making them do more than existing buildings would have to do because we have points tied to the fact that if a building is already there, there are a certain number of points that you can get towards your certification that are not attainable if you're building a new building. So there's some of that I think is going on, and we've been playing around with a couple of pilot credits that deal specifically with the issue of life cycle and life cycle assessment on the big heavy stuff in buildings, so structure and envelope specifically, because that's really where the biggest environmental footprint of during the design and construction process happens to be. Over time, its interior churn rapidly catches that. But in terms of being able to inform the decisions that are being built around that, that's really an alternatives assessment question. And I sometimes think that the exercise of going through and quantifying the embodied carbon of a brick in a wall is coming at it from the wrong way. We should be looking at that as an asset that has basically a life cycle impact it's a sunk cost, if you want to think about it from an economic standpoint, which I don't tend to do all that often. But it's a sunk cost. It's there. We've expended the energy. We can't get it back. The carbon's in the atmosphere, and that's that. But when we're replacing it or we're knocking it down, we should be looking at those new buildings as sort of deficit laden and maybe holding them up to a higher level of performance as a result of the fact that they're creating a problem that isn't there today in some ways.
I have no disagreement with that. I guess I come from the consumer end, the user end more, since I'm a practicing architect and a homeowner. And again, back to the Prius model, that I think I'd like to see, just as you can, just as the food industry embraced, organic as a label and are trying to standardize that, I think if the systems you use in your house are as responsive as the feedback you get from your car, that to me is a way to consolidate these conversations. Your experience of using the building and related to its energy use, I think is a far more productive way to get people motivated rather than regulating or requiring them to measure their use. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I tend to look at it.
Just picking up on that, I think you're talking about the power of data and understanding how the building is performing and how that's in fact informing the occupants of the building. I think that touches on a really important piece of how we're operating the buildings, making sure that information is available both
Absolutely.
to the facility managers as well as the building occupants, so we can engage both the building from a sort of O&M perspective from base building systems as well as occupants.
But let's not deny that your intuitive understanding of how, for example, your house works and what's holding up and what you need to maintain. Historic structures, you can look at it, what's still remaining, what's standing, what's working, has stood the test of time. You don't have to really assess the performance of it. A lot of projects I'm working on now, for example, we're finally replacing a slate roof on a 118-year-old building, and 118 years for a slate roof, that's reasonable maintenance, I think, and copper flashing, that sort of thing. So again, I don't think it has to be a very sophisticated thing, and that the way you use a building and your understanding of energy use, daylighting, ventilation, those sort of things, if there's a common sense strategy to how the systems are approached and how the energy use is going to be, it's going to happen in the building, I think that will, again, connect the importance of the building with how you use it.
You're talking about a 118-year-old building. Let's get to where it starts to get really tricky, and let's talk about a 40 or 50-year-old building. The unique challenges of dealing with buildings that were really at the trough, historically speaking, in terms of their energy consumption, or energy efficiency, I should say. GSA has a large portfolio of buildings from that era. How are you seeing new technologies, new strategies, new materials being developed that are going to help us deal with this? I understand that GSA found that around 1930 was a significant cutoff in terms of the performance of these buildings. How are you dealing with that, and how do you make the case if you have perhaps less of an improvement, but still an improvement in the energy performance and the sustainability of a building if it's a younger building rather than an older one?
Well, certainly, based on a study we conducted in 1999, we did find that our older assets, so the 1930s assets, were performing a lot better, and that's probably mostly due to the inherent design characteristics of the building, so the thicker walls, fewer windows, natural ventilation, daylighting, et cetera. And so when we get to, we have an increasing number of buildings that are now hitting that critical 45 to 50 year mark, and where we do want to find strategies to reinvest. And I think what we're finding is that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Each building has to be understood within its context, within its climate zone, and that there's no really one particular strategy that works. So our goal has always been to take a look at the asset, determine whether or not it meets some of the eligibility criteria under the register, and then also then take a look at what strategies are possible and in the building, and there could be different parts of the building that we might be able to affect differently depending on their significance. And so in the areas where there's less significance in terms of its historical aspect, we probably have a bit more leeway in terms of implementing new technologies. But we've certainly, definitely with the investments under the Recovery Act, looked at just smart sort of lighting systems, looking at new HVAC control systems. So we are looking at new strategies. We also have, for instance, one of our courthouses in Colorado has a solar roof panel on it. It's actually one of the buildings that we're targeting for net zero energy in Colorado. And so we took a look at how to install solar panels on the roof of that building, and found that it would actually, after a few iterative sort of design on how it would best work, that it was more efficient to raise the solar panels and not to have them directly applied to the roof, that it would facilitate O&M, and it actually provided us with the opportunity to put more panels. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, and there are different opportunities for us, and it's really a lot about context and climate.
Any comments from the others about the particular problems of more recent?
I think that's a huge challenge now, just in terms of the assessment side in the preservation community. I know in the audience we have some experts on GSA buildings of the recent past, significant architectural ones, and hopefully they'll discuss how it's been renovating those buildings. But I think that in my own practice, we recently worked on the Watergate, which I think is a building that represents, certainly technological innovation, but is kind of an energy monster. And the particular project involved 2 floors and the penthouse of the structure, and what we discovered is that we were starting from scratch, essentially. And there was nothing of the systems, the bones of the apartment, which was a substantial piece of the building, that could remain. So, how do you have a sustainable approach when you're going down just to the structure? We ended up doing a lot of replacing windows, replacing electrical systems, and installing a green roof on what was an entirely hard surface. So, speaking to what you said, the framework for is an individualized approach. And it's a lot easier to look at a building that was at turn of the century, that's masonry with a nice slate roof, and say, okay, we know what to do. But when you get into these more experimental or innovative buildings of the recent past, it's a real challenge.
Do any of you see any new materials on the horizon that may help address some of those issues, or new technologies? It's funny, we keep joking, it keeps coming up that it all comes down to windows.
It does.
And so many of us can think of examples where that's really the crux of the matter, is you've got potentially conflicting issues there. Any suggestions or advice or experiences that you've had that contribute to this that maybe point some new directions in how we'll address that?
I'm a huge fan of geo-exchange systems. I think this is, and I don't know if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, they essentially, geothermal systems use the temperature of the earth to heat and cool a building. It has a very light footprint on an existing building. It's a matter of digging a well, and internally in the building, the way you can transfer the heat and the cooling can be a very light system intervention in an existing building. I think for this climate, for this area, it's one of the most powerful ways to change energy consumption in a building. People get very excited about the idea of solar and wind power. In my own practice, we have not really utilized those two technologies in any significant way on projects. We've done projects that are considered carbon neutral. We've done LEED certified buildings. But really, for me, that's one specific technology in this region that has a huge impact and can be done in urban areas as well as rural areas. We've done it in both applications. So that's one example, I think.
I think that geo-exchange systems are a great solution, especially when they're coupled with hydronic heating and cooling systems. So we tend to, in some of the 50s buildings, 60s buildings, we started moving around heating and cooling in air instead of in something with a relatively denser thermal property. So part of the reason that the buildings aren't performing as well is because they're moving around, a relatively expensive thing in an extraordinarily inefficient medium. So when you're going through and you're retrofitting some of those buildings, I like the use of the term light touch, because you can pack a whole bunch more heat and a whole bunch more cooling in a pound of water than you can in a pound of air. So from the standpoint of utilizing those systems and then dedicated outside air systems to sort of minimize the effect of the overall renovation on the building, I think there are some tremendously exciting technologies that are coming about.
And from a preservation point of view, what that translates into is you don't have cooling towers, you don't have outside equipment that you have to locate around the building. It eliminates noise, all kinds of things. It's friendly to your neighbors. So that's one example. I think there's also certainly recycled content, materials, surfaces, whether they're interior, exterior. Now, there's not one manufacturer that I know of that isn't trying to promote that in their own products. I've seen a lot of solar responsive products that may be very traditional things, but a lot of manufacturers are looking at, in terms of the envelope of buildings, how can their product be solar responsive, whether it's awnings or metal or something like that. And then a lot of traditional building materials that have tried and true are really looking at how they can format their material, whether it's zinc or copper or clay tiles, terracotta tiles, in a more contemporary fashion. So I think definitely on the building manufacturer side, the industry is aware of that owners, architects are interested in products that are sustainable, and how can they just lend to being interpreted in a more contemporary fashion, as well as serve preservation needs.
It's funny you started this question with, it always comes down to windows, and one of the examples that we're working on right now is we're undergoing a major retrofit of our headquarters here in DC, and originally we had operable windows which are now painted shut, and we would like to go back to operable windows, and there's been a lot of conversation with the engineers about how you then balance the having operable windows with the HVAC systems, and that goes back again to education as part of the design process, but also with the building occupants in terms of, is this actually going to work? Are people going to open and close their windows at the right time? So they could be really basic strategies as well as new technologies. It's how do we then sort of relearn some of the basic strategies from the 1930s? Right.
And to follow on that, I mean, we talked about energy a bit. Efficiency first, efficiency second, efficiency third, and then we can talk about renewables. So just that's my general sense of that. But in terms of other building materials, I think one of the things that is interesting is that as the building materials have gotten more complicated, we've sort of started to use building materials that we don't really understand the entire life cycle from an exposure, human exposure, health pathways that we just don't understand them, right? And we're sticking them in buildings, and I think there's some lurking problems in, the next asbestos is probably already in buildings. I think we should probably just recognize that fact. But from a preservation standpoint, the fact that we're using hard surface floors and wood and plaster and just the traditional building materials, they are significantly more inert from a human impact. And I think that there's a relative level of, information that needs to be exchanged in order to highlight the importance of the impacts of the building materials that we're installing in buildings, that the preservation community could teach the public health community quite a bit about. Because we're sort of mitigating in a lot of instances the impacts associated with bad materials choices, when the best way to mitigate them is to not make those choices to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about windows then.
Fair enough.
For example,
I'm going to pass it.
My understanding is that in LEED rating systems, that if you had vinyl windows, you get a certain amount of points, versus if you kept your window and made it operable, might not get the same amount of value to it. And I think that, I know that's one little pet peeve in the preservation community. Why do vinyl windows, the questioning really the sort of toxicity of vinyl and that sort of thing. From a perform, so it's not put in a vinyl window, you get points. It's put in a window that performs better than makes your wall assembly perform better, and you get points. Windows are a complicated thing for me. I have a lot of personal angst about them, because there's a company out in California, give them a shout out, Serious Materials. If you don't know Serious Materials, well, you might not. It's a big preservation community. They make fiberglass windows that have an assembly R value of 13. Right? There are walls in this building that don't have an assembly value of 13, on R value of 13. Yeah, right. So, I mean, and that's a wall, right? That's what we're actually using for there's insulation in those walls. So the performance of a lot of these newer technologies is really, really getting very difficult for me to not gravitate towards, and I don't think that's just the engineer in me. It might be, but in terms of what we're looking at from the standpoint of what we reward in the rating system, we're trying to reward performance, and energy use in buildings, depending on where it's located. When you look at the carbon footprint of the building, the carbon footprint of the building will be between 60 and 80, and depending on where it is, 90% will be tied up in the energy use of operational energy use of the building, and no design decision you can make in terms of specification of materials, even when you take into account periodic churn in buildings, gets you to a life cycle carbon footprint of more than 15%. And that's an extraordinarily challenging nut to crack, and I think that this is really, there is kind of a rub there. Right. Well, performance is not the only aspect of sustainability.
That's true.
I mean, and I think that's where, certainly in evaluating the LCA metrics on things. When does if the window gets broken, it has to be replaced in its entirety.
Yeah.
So there's landfill, there's toxicity issues, as opposed to fixing the latch on to make sure your casement window is sealed and tight and insulating it, and all the things that the sort of maintenance-oriented things that one can do to get the performance that improvement. I think as a sustainable preservation strategy, one of the biggest issues is simply maintenance. Can the user maintain their building? As an architect, you have a great one has a great responsibility to use materials, design a structure that knowing that the owner can maintain it, whether it's from the economic side or just understanding how these things perform. And I agree with you that they're, right now it's a very experimental phase in terms of design and materials, with some really, wonderful results, but also there's a big question mark, what's going to stand the test of time. And so I think you can learn a lot just from looking from existing buildings, what has stood the test of time, and can be a great source of inspiration.
And this is something we talked about earlier, the whole notion of education and how important that is, both as we talked about in the academic context, but also as you operate and maintain the buildings. How are you engaging your facilities teams? How are you engaging your design teams as you're doing major retrofits in the specific needs and the ability to maintain the materials, but also maintain the systems as they were designed? So that's really a critical piece in making sure we get to that optimum performance and durability and maintenance.
It's an interesting idea. Famously, Boeing at some point brought in the maintenance workers, people who maintain the planes, to help design the next generation of airplanes. I believe it was for the 767. Have you heard of any design processes, any architecture firms, any projects that are trying to do similar sorts of things, bringing in the operations and maintenance people at the design phase to influence how the building's going to perform?
I think that's part of the design process. Absolutely, you're involving their experience, whether it's an individual user, an institution. If you don't understand their needs or their culture, it's not going to reflect in what you design ultimately or build for them. So I don't think that's a new idea. I think that's a major tenet of an architect's responsibility.
Yeah, I don't think it happens as much as it should. It's not uncommon, but if you're not doing it, everybody out there, you should.
You're in trouble.
Yeah.
And I think this is coming.
Go ahead.
I think it's coming up a lot in the context of some of the new mechanisms we might have to look at very efficient buildings. When you talk about sort of design build combination, sort of the integrated delivery process, where you want to engage your designers, all your stakeholders, and your O&M team, so that you really do have that follow through from the design to the O&M.
Okay, maybe a way to say it is, if the guy who has the big ring of keys walking around your building isn't happy, you're not going to be. So get him in the room.
Well, that's the person that ultimately will have more influence over the owner.
Yeah.
And, they'll complain about what so and so specified, and how that doesn't work, and that can ruin careers right there.
Right.
We sometimes encounter that in some of the buildings that are newly constructed, where we have sophisticated systems, but then that when it comes time to pass off the building to our operations team, that the knowledge on the operational side just isn't there. So we don't want to fall into a situation where we have this great modeled building, but yet on the operations side, the team is not aware of how to make the property function as it should.
We'll take a break to make sure that we get in some questions from the audience at this point. Scott, if you want to minister that. Anyone?
Sure, if you can raise your hand and I'll come to you. I'm going to start though really first quick with a treaty question that we have. What is the most compelling statistic you've seen to promote combined good sustainability and preservation?
Okay.
Statistic. So on whether that's energy use, whether it's embodied energy, whether that's something else that you've touched on so far?
Mine is VMT, vehicle miles traveled, as a function of urban density. So VMT is inversely proportional to density. The less dense your location is, the more vehicle miles will be traveled in it. The more dense, the less VMT. So there is also, interestingly enough, a direct one-to-one relationship in terms of carbon footprint associated with that. So that's the most compelling statistic that I'm aware of. It has nothing, honestly, to do with individual buildings, and has everything to do with the fabric of the community that is represented by these buildings.
Eleni, you had a statistic about New York City that you mentioned earlier.
Right. I mean, typically, when you look nationally, buildings account for about 40% of carbon emissions. But when you look at really dense urban environments like New York City, it's more around 79%. So that really speaks to density. It speaks to transit. And so how do all those parts relate?
Questions? You can raise your hand.
All right, I get to start first. I wanted to pick up on the material retention point that you raised about the windows and take it out of windows. I think that I work for a state government, and we have a pretty substantial incentive program for historic preservation and a pretty substantial regulatory program as well. But I think one of the issues that you run into with a lot of those projects is that LEED values the things that you do, but not necessarily the things that you don't do. So let's talk about, like, say, a wood floor. If you have a historic wood floor in a building, maintaining that or retaining it, polishing it, keeping it as part of a feature, you don't get a point for. But you do get a point for taking it out and recycling it, and maybe a point for putting in a wood, a bamboo wood replacement. So when you're trying to meet both sets of strictures and requirements, and in some cases in our state, there is a mandate to achieve a certain level of LEED accreditation or performance in order to receive some or all of that incentive or meet that regulatory burden. That's where I feel like particularly the LEED system doesn't go far enough to say, yes, you get a point for keeping 50% of the building shell or keeping the entire shell, but you get the same amount of points for sending everything inside of it to the landfill. So.
Yeah, and I think that it's targeted. I think that's a fair criticism. Yeah,
Pick on the lead
and
guy.
it's something that I was actually kind of I'm on the board for the New Buildings Institute, which I think is rather unfortunate, but they do a lot of existing building stuff. So I can't tell you how many conversations we've had about how we value not doing something, right? So what's the benchmark against which we measure action? And I think that in those cases are where the embodied energy of the existing materials are the places that can serve the best benchmarks, right? So the technical advisory groups that are responsible for helping, well, not responsible for helping, they are responsible for developing the LEED rating system. And then you guys are all responsible for voting for it, if you agree with us, are struggling with that right now. So we're in the middle of a development cycle for the next version of the rating system, and not doing something is high on their list of things that they're trying to find ways to quantify the benefit of. It becomes gameable so quickly that the pendulum swings very far to the other side of being just kind of laughable if you don't structure the benchmarks accordingly. And I hope that we can thread that needle. I expect that we have smart enough people to do it if there's a solution. But if you have any ideas about how that would work, anybody in the audience, about any aspect of the rating system, please don't hesitate to shoot us an email. We've radically changed the way that we accept comment about the development of the rating system. It used to be, very closed, regimented, dare I say, ANSI-like. And now we've basically said, look, any idea coming up at any point during the development of the rating system is fair game. And even though the public comment closed in the middle of January, and we're still accepting ideas, so send them our way, please.
I'd like to sort of scale that issue up a little bit, and I guess this goes to the first comment, something about statistics. In the district, we have 45 historic districts, and I'm going to get this number wrong. I want to say 65,000 historic landmarks. Jim Kane's in the audience somewhere, former board member. He can say that's true. Okay, he's nodding his head. And DC passed their Green Building Act in 2006, I think, which addresses new construction over 50,000 square feet and sort of benchmarks of performance for that. But a lot of our inventory is existing. There's obviously a gap. There's a lot of excitement about new construction and its performance, but we are in the district dealing with the majority of existing fabric. And I know LEED is working on district neighborhood statistics. Certainly that our historic districts are part of the values of smart growth. And
I would put it the other way around.
Okay,
Smart growth embodies those ideas.
I'm a Hummer here, so. At any rate, my point was that at a larger scale, the impact it's obvious, and that whether you can measure it, I'm not sure how you measure it.
Yeah.
Down to the wood floors, there's sort of a gap between the eagerness to adopt your metrics to regulation, and then the reality of what we have and measuring what we have and sort of valuing that.
Another question.
I would like to suggest that in putting these new regs together or procedures together. Sorry. I'd like to suggest in putting the new regulations or procedures in place that there could be a partnership which required with, say, the Department of Interior that the applicant had to provide evidence according to these Interior Department standards we are accustomed to in National Register nominations. That would be able to provide, if those regulations require that your applicant provides that kind of evidence of value and original intention of design, you begin to have a measurement against which you can say, is this wall, floor, corbel of value? And if so, of what value, and how do I know that's of value? Now, that information from Interior is public information, and it would be a good way for both agencies to cooperate.
I actually read the Secretary's criteria last night in preparation for this, and I didn't look at them with that lens, but it's interesting to think of them that way.
So I think maybe this session was I think it could be titled a little differently, because I don't think it's historic preservation versus sustainability. I think the perception is historic preservation and sustainability versus economic growth. And I just finished a very good book called Down Detour Road, An Architect in Search of Practice. And the author makes a very compelling argument that the most sustainable building is the one that we don't build. But architects and developers and contractors don't like to hear that, because they spend most of their time in the arena of new construction. So how can we demonstrate, or at least overcome the perception or the reality that economic growth is opposed to historic preservation and sustainability?
I mean, one of the things that is happening with the shift in, less new construction based on the current state of the economy to focusing on retrofits is that there's a whole new industry of jobs around energy audits and looking at sort of a different angle where, you still need to invest in the properties. It's just perhaps a different type of skill set where you're looking more for, the engineers who are going to be able to help do the walkthroughs, understand what needs to be audited. We're also very interested in, for instance, benchmarking against Energy Star. So there's a whole other, I think, there's a movement to shift, those jobs to other types of jobs that are really, focused on how do you revitalize and how do you rehabilitate and reinvest in existing buildings.
Well, creating historic districts is absolutely a model for that, on how revitalization can create economic development. You can look, I don't know if many of you are locals and have been in DC, let's say just the past 20 years, you can look at neighborhoods, for the U Street corridor, for example, in Shaw, and how organic, just by preserving and identifying what are the cultural resources of those neighborhoods, has helped in the planning efforts and the economic development efforts of those neighborhoods, and it's amazing, and it's spread across the city. So maybe the polarity you're setting up isn't true either, and at least from my point of view.
I think the point of economic growth is very interesting, and in a lot of ways, on that particular point, the preservation movement that I have read about, and the green building movement that I have sort of sat in the middle of, are almost mirror images of the way that they grew up. So when I was starting with USGBC, we were really leading with the passion, right? With this is the right thing to do, this is the responsible thing to do, and I think that what we experienced is that it got us in the door of the evil developers. It didn't keep us in the door, though, because those people were really kind of fed up with the whole passion factor after about 3 or 4 months. They were like, "There's nothing here. It's all just people shouting at us and telling us to do good things." So the tack that changed, and it was, I think, a critical shift in the way that the green building movement evolved, was to go after the economic arguments of why these things are good ideas, and it's a mirror image of the way that the preservation
absolutely
community, galvanized itself and made itself relevant.
And we were talking earlier about how there's almost a generational gap, perhaps, or not, in those movements, and that it's just a matter of putting those people all in the same room.
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you how much I've learned. So Barbara Campagna, who is with the trust and is sadly leaving the trust, is a really good friend of mine. And I can't tell you how much I've sort of she said, "Oh, we did this," and it was just like, "Oh, wow, great! Let's go and take that and steal that idea," and it saved me months of work. It's great.
We'll take one more question, then we'll go back to moderated discussion, then we'll end with some more questions. In the back.
I guess going back to the topic you said about the economic growth, I wonder if you could speak to, possibly, I see it that in some ways, because of the current economic climate, the economic growth that we were used to over the last several decades was in itself inherently unsustainable. And I wonder if you could speak to the opportunities we have at this point in time, where we have an economic downturn that is at the same time forcing us to kind of look at our building stock differently and really take stock of how we can shape our industry to become one that's more about maintenance than about new construction.
If I might add,
Amen.
And Brennan, if you could maybe responding to that, you could talk a little bit about something you mentioned earlier about the sort of the switch and move towards lead for existing buildings and the relationship to the economy and so on and so forth. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. So the growth, we monitor growth curves associated with building certifications, but the more telling statistics from my perspective are buildings that are registering for LEED. At the beginning of 2009, which was just at the start of when things were really starting to get bad, before it actually had to collapse, our existing buildings portfolio, in terms of number of registrations, was already catching our new construction portfolio. Part of that is due to the fact that the existing buildings market is 80 times as large as the new construction market, so there's some factors of scale in there. But I think what happened was that the real estate community started to realize that they could capitalize on this LEED thing, which the market, still doesn't really fully understand. I talk to plenty of people who don't know the difference between existing buildings certification and new construction certification still today, and I think what they were thinking was that they can capitalize on the fact that it's LEED, and they get to call it LEED, and people won't necessarily know the difference. And some of that was happening, but the trend was going. Existing buildings was going to overtake our design and construction, new construction rating systems, regardless of what happened with the market. It looks, it is very dramatic how much those two curves diverged, and part of that is due to just circumstances, but it was going to happen anyway, and that really, from my perspective as an existing buildings guy, I was really very happy to see that occurring, and I think part of what the time lag is due to the fact that I came up through facilities, and during the formative years of my career when I was doing performance contracting, I probably talked to 20 facility managers for every designer or architect that I talked to, and as a result, I go to a lot of facility management conferences, and I also now, in the role that I'm in right now, go to things like NeoCon and the IAA convention, and I am still to this day struck at how much better looking the average attendee at NeoCon or AIA is than the facility management conferences, even though those are my people. I mean, that's where I feel the most at home. And from my perspective, the delay in existing buildings is largely summed up by just that discrepancy. It's just way more interesting to talk about new construction. It's sexier.
Well, I'd hate to displace the idea of design or design leadership with notion of maintenance. I don't think that's your choice.
Yeah, again, it's false dichotomy. Yeah, very false dichotomy.
So, I've been through a few recessions now. There's, they come and go. You follow the economy. But again, I don't know if your background is preservation or architecture or whatever, landscape. I'm very optimistic about architects taking the lead in innovation. We are strategic thinkers, in our education. That's what you're developing. And certainly we've seen architects take the lead with the industry. Certainly William McDonough is a great example of that. It doesn't have to be just about the building. I mean, you're creating solutions on a much bigger scale than that. So whether you're focused on existing conditions and how rehabilitation or adaptability can be the next stage, or if it's new construction, you're using the same approach. So I don't think you're giving anything up.
I would just argue, though, that, for us, with the size of our portfolio, it's really the focus of our efforts. Obviously we have a new construction program, but we have an existing stock of many buildings nationally, and we're really investing in how we can green our operations and maintenance, as well as invest in sort of new technologies. We have a smart buildings program that we're developing, where we're looking at including technology integration, controls integration, so that we can better inform the property managers, so that they can make wiser and faster decisions and get to repair the equipment in a timely manner, therefore get faster to energy efficiency. So I think engaging the property management team is really key to that success. And while we will continue to need our support from the design community as we go into major retrofits, there's so much we can do, I think, in the basic green O&M, and overlay that with new approaches, new technology. And when we do need to do substantial retrofit, then of course we engage with our engineers and our A&E firms.
Two related questions. Presumably all of you are in a position to deal with a variety of colleagues and clients and others from a wide range of ages. Do you see any sort of generational shifts in terms of the individuals and their perceptions of these issues and their relationship? And then the related question is, you're probably, on occasion at least, dealing with people fresh out of school. Can you assess the educational, or the role of education in professional education in particular, in influencing people's views about sustainability and preservation? There are some preservation programs out there. There are now increasingly sustainable design and real estate programs. Are they all talking together enough at the educational level, at the university level? So two related questions about the generational shift and the educational background.
Well, in our own practice, we were talking about this earlier. I see that it's part of the value system of our younger staff coming in. Sustainability is part of the value system. It's not, and they're excited to be LEED certified, just as excited to be LEED certified as they are to get registered, which is a little bit of a problem sometimes. But to me, that's very exciting. That there's no need to educate them. And then from the, I'm not too involved in the academic side. I can't speak to how educational institutions are addressing it, but I think it probably is attracting a lot more people that might not have looked at preservation or architecture, and that I'm excited by that too. I mean, that's encouraging to me.
And I every year I go back to I graduated from Purdue University in Indiana, and I go back and I talk to the capstone senior design class in the civil engineering department. And generally speaking, what they do is their capstone project is a building of some sort or another. And I do I talk about integrated design. I talk about green building, and I am amazed by how thirsty they are for the information. And I am similarly amazed at how they've never seen it before, right? So it's not ingrained in the curriculum from an engineering perspective, and I can't really speak to the architecture aspect of it, but I think that my sense is that trend is going to have to change, or the uprising that's coming will rapidly obsolete the curriculums that are out there, because one of the things that USGBC does, and I'm proudest of from the work that we do, is run an organization called the Center for Green Schools at USGBC, and the center is really all about students, K through 12 up into higher ed as well. And the people who work for the center at USGBC talk about the idea of a sustainability native, like a kid who has never existed in a world where caring about your carbon footprint was something that people did, right? It's kind of the technology native all over again, but it's this aspect of, something that is so ingrained in who these children are, that if we don't, honestly, if we don't keep up with them, we're going to be looking in the rearview mirror saying, what have we been doing? So I think that it's the reason that I'm proud to be affiliated with USGBC and the center is because that's the single biggest reason that I think that we should have for hope. These kids just get it. It's not something that they question. They don't care about scientific consensus or the arguments associated with all that stuff. It's just part of who they are, and I think that it's encouraging from my perspective.
And coming from a large organization like GSA, PBS is the real estate arm, but we also have the Federal Acquisition Service, and our administrator announced about a year now ago that we have an aspirational goal to achieve zero environmental footprint. And her comment is that as she talks about this more and more, we have so many people wanting to apply for jobs at GSA because it is really, I think, galvanizing not only our workforce inside GSA, but also it's attracting a lot of talent. And I'm finding just in the colleagues and my peers that it can be a generational issue, but it's also people are just so motivated that they want to be part of this movement within the organization, and the organization has to find channels to put this energy to productive use so that we are, aligned in our goals and how we're going to achieve them. So it can be a generational issue, but I think it's really served to galvanize our people. And one of the other interesting things too is that education is a constant for us, and so we're investing a lot in, for instance, we have a national training curriculum at the Public Building Service, and what we're trying to do now is just weave in a lot of sort of basic sustainability training, and so we're looking at not only professional accreditation through GBCI, for instance, going through LEED GA and AP credentials, and we have already about 200 of our people in GSA with that credential, but then looking at our executive orders, how that affects people's business, their jobs. And then we have this really exciting piece of legislation that was passed last fall, the Federal Buildings Personnel Training Act, which is requiring property managers across all federal agencies to take training, and we're currently developing, in coordination with the Department of Energy, core curriculum for facility managers. So our organization is very excited about that prospect to be able to train and engage our property managers.
You I think, talked a little bit earlier about post-occupancy evaluation. And what sort of things are you doing, particularly at GSA, where you have such a huge pool from which to draw? And what sort of things are you learning as you go through those processes, particularly as regards to preservation and sustainability issues?
Well, we conducted a post-occupancy evaluation of 12 buildings a few years ago, and we now are just putting the finishing touches on a follow-up to that post-occupancy evaluation study on 22 buildings. And we're finding that consistently that our buildings that have sustainable attributes are performing better, both from a carbon footprint, energy performance, and also have lower operating costs. So we're really finding that there's a correlation. It's a small subset of our buildings, but we're really also trying to build post-occupancy evaluation into the way we do business, so to have more than just these 22 buildings. And we're currently setting up a process for POEs and are looking at 6 pilot projects right now. So it's really going to be woven into the way we do business going forward.
Time for some more questions from the audience?
We got one more tweeted question that I'm going to paraphrase. We've talked about the economics of sustainability and historic preservation, but what about the social and cultural aspects of historic preservation and sustainability? Perhaps I'll give that to Maria first, and we can go on down.
You don't want to pick on the lead guy? Well, the framework of sustainable preservation is the economic, the environmental, and the cultural. And I think stewardship of the man-made environment and the natural environment should include how a neighborhood, a city, a culture values its resources. And so those resources will be built resources, there'll be neighborhoods. So it's just as an important piece in how we approach building and rehabilitation as looking at the economic and environmental impacts. So it's important.
So I'll pick on the lead guy. So in prepping for this conversation, because that's part of the crux of the issue, right? I reread a book that I don't think it's untrue to say that it really changed the way that I look at everything that I do. Do anybody know How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand? Yeah. If you don't know this book, go get it. Students in the back, I know you're probably all in the back, right? This is a very important piece of your professional life, I hope. And Brand talks about the aesthetic of infrastructure, and he talks about the fact that the community fabric is every bit as important as the sewers and the electricity grid and all of that, and he's right. And the challenge that we've had, because we're a quantifier, right, of stuff, and we're a certifier of buildings and of building performance, is quantifying it, right? So when we started going through the development of the 2009 version of the rating system, we changed the way that we allocate importance to credits in the rating system. We changed the way we weight things. And we used a framework that was based in a methodology that is all about doing less bad. We used an LCA concept that EPA created in the mid-90s to represent the life cycle assessment field. And the reality is that it's a very strange way. It accomplished what we wanted to accomplish with it. But going into the development that we're currently in the middle of, we wanted to not talk about doing less bad. All of the rating systems that are out there, and this is not a criticism, all the rating systems that are out there internationally are rooted in this, here's how we do less bad. And we wanted to make a conscious decision in the development of the rating system to talk about the things that we wanted our buildings to be good at. So the impact categories that we are proposing to use for the next version of LEED, and I'm going to talk about them specifically from my book because I don't want to leave anything out and then look like a fool. We want buildings to reverse their contribution to global climate change. We want them to enhance individual health, well-being, and vitality. I want them to protect and restore water resources, protect and restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, conserve and renew natural resources, promote transformative processes, innovation, and the development of a green economy. And the one that we are struggling with the most, and the one that we need your help with, is the last one. And it's enhanced social equity, environmental justice, community health, and quality of life. Right? So this is going to be a piece of the rating system going forward that we really, it's early, right? We're not launching the next version of the rating system, hopefully until the end of 2012, so we got some time. So I don't think I'm talking too much out of school by saying we're struggling here. We're really trying to figure out what that means for our tool, right? LEED is a market transformation tool, and we want to figure out how to capitalize on this megaphone that we're lucky enough to stand behind, and we are struggling. So please help.
Well, I have an answer for you, and you just have to talk to your preservation friends. We talked about economics in terms of cost, but really, I think, again, one of the values of the preservation community was this notion of economic equality. And when you're preserving a neighborhood, you're encouraging the people that live there to remain there. One thing that DC has done through the Preservation Office has created a homeowner grant system, program rather, and it was a pilot project started 2 years ago in historic Anacostia. And what it did was give micro grants to homeowners in the historic district to improve their houses. And it was simply either window replacement or removing vinyl siding and painting the wood siding underneath it. And the impact of that was extraordinary. It not only kept longtime homeowners in their homes, but it also had an amazing organic effect on the entire historic district, so that entire blocks turned over. And this is in a matter of 2 years. And the oversight of it was really lean. It was, the grants were just given by the staff members at HPO to individual applicants. It was overseen by the staff members, and volunteers from the local architectural community helped in oversight of the construction. And we're not talking a lot of money. It was a couple $100,000 overall of the DC budget allocated for this, but its impact was enormous. Now, I think it speaks to this kind of notion of social justice, that revitalization doesn't mean displacement, that we're educating people on how to maintain their homes and not have to be, again, displaced because the value of their home is suddenly increased because they're in a historic district and they can't afford it. I think really simple ideas like that can be very powerful, and that's certainly an attitude that started the preservation movement. So, there can be small ideas. solve these problems.
I think it's also exciting because you're starting to look beyond the building envelope and look at the role the building might play in the community, especially if you're thinking about sort of anchor buildings that might be some of our maybe historic properties where they're anchors in the central business district and they play sort of a greater role than just the building itself. It's interaction with people who come in the buildings to receive services, but also the employees, and they're sort of in a hub where there's a lot of activity going on, and we want to be as positive contributors, I think, to that particular environment. So how do we get to a point where buildings are more regenerative and also sort of reach out to the social aspects and engage the community a bit more? That's really exciting.
And if I could make another plug for the program, because DC and many other cities are undergoing tremendous budget issues, that program is not funded this year, but if you want to write to your local council person and encourage them to fund it, I'd like to encourage you to do that.
Want to take a couple more questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll have some final closing comments.
As I'm sure most of us here have noticed, LEED is being adopted by local jurisdictions, and we can't get away from it anymore. So one of the things that I think local architects will see is that the way in which the local jurisdiction adopts the code and interprets the code or the standard, that's where the rubber meets the road with preservation. And I think in many cases there's a lack of understanding in the local code and permitting department about how this is supposed to work, what types of buildings it might apply to, and even latching on to maybe some of the wrong things about it for the wrong types of buildings. And so I guess what I'd like to ask is how are you helping local jurisdictions to implement this and not impact historic buildings and not impact historic neighborhoods? So for example, in Baltimore, I know some projects where it's a rehab of a row house and the code inspectors come in and say, well, this isn't green unless you fur out the interior walls. And it was never meant to be like that in a row house. And for example, with the LEED new development, LEED neighborhood development rating system, then there's a risk that a local jurisdiction could use that system to incentivize new development over investment in existing neighborhoods.
Yeah. So it's a great point. And about 6 years ago, we started to see the first of those jurisdictional adoptions of LEED as a proxy for a building code start to happen. And the way that I think about it is that progressive politicians and city councils were looking around for a hammer, and they saw LEED, and it's a screwdriver, and they said, I can hammer in a nail with that, right? So about 5 years ago, we started the development of Standard 189, which is a code-intended green building standard, and partnered earlier in 2010 with the International Code Council to have 189 referenced into the International Green Construction Code. These are code-intended documents that are they are hammers. If a city council or a politician is looking for a hammer, we built them a hammer, and we're hoping that that's going to alleviate the misuse of our screwdriver. And our advocacy shop is really on the ball in terms of talking about the separate, distinct but complementary nature of green building codes and green building rating systems. And if there are, I'll stop because I'm not interested in probably spending the rest of the time talking about regulations, but if there are specific instances, please just give us a ring, and we have go to the website, look at our government advocacy stuff. There's a really great white paper on that exact issue, because it is challenging. And LEED wasn't written to be a building code, and it, in my opinion, I think I know a thing or two about it. If I don't seem too immodest by saying it, it doesn't really perform well as one. So we're there with you. We haven't understood the problem a while ago, and and have worked to correct it. There ripples of those changes should be coming your way soon, hopefully.
And I think for us, the tie-in...
Well, you're a building owner. That's different.
Yeah, but we get asked that question very frequently. I mean, it clearly is not a standard, and we've heard some of the conversation tonight about how there are some issues with LEED credits, and we certainly don't want the LEED system to drive, I think, how we're approaching retrofits of the building. From our perspective, it's more a tool to measure and evaluate, so it's not the end-all. We have our guiding principles that are our framework, and then we map them against some of the LEED credits and prerequisites to make sure we're capturing some of the performance and the intent. So I think
it's a screwdriver with a ruler in it.
Yeah, it's a tool for measurement.
But as a practical matter, what the point you bring up is exactly what's happening. It's being used as the code, and I think an answer to that, I know in our office some of the architects have gotten involved in the review of codes. I know in DC they're reviewing all the codes now and updating them. And architects, you have to get out there, so it's not just the engineers saying, yes, R40 sounds great, but you need 14-inch joists to do that, and no one's going to build a house with that. So that is an issue, absolutely. I think you brought up an interesting point about density. That's something that I've seen can divide the preservation community, and there's a lot of fear about the idea of density and smart growth, which is, we're going to get off lead for a little bit if you don't mind. And I think, again, it's more fear than reality. Preservation certainly makes a great argument about economic development, but we shouldn't be afraid of density. And at its heart, preservation is about adaptability and revitalization. That's probably another topic for another day.
And perhaps I'll ask the last question. What are some final thoughts? We've covered a lot of topics tonight, and I think it's been a really rich dialogue. What are some of the one or two key main points that you'd like this audience to leave with after tonight's rich discussion?
Sure. I think two things. One is that for us, the reinvestment in our existing portfolio is really the way that we are conducting business, and sustainability is certainly not new. And in that sense, we really feel that historic preservation and sustainability work hand in hand. The other thing is that it's really about integration. It's this aspect of how do you align and really marry the notion of environmental efficiency and historic preservation, and it's really integrating the both and having this really rich dialogue to achieve, I think, those common goals. So I think it's served as an integrator for us. We were able to take a look at our different executive orders and mandates and really see how all of them could work together, not only from a building performance standpoint, but also locational decisions, or a whole set of factors that we were able to look at and integrate as we look to both historic preservation and environmental efficiency across our portfolio.
Thank you.
I get so my personal history with preservation is complicated is the right word, Al and Stephanie, right? So the City of Alexandria Planning and Zoning Historic Preservation people are in the front row here. But Wendy, my wife, and I live in Old Town, and we renovated a row house that was built in late 1890s, 1900s, somewhere in there. And I'll be the first to say that mistakes were made, and most of them were mine. And I think it was due to the fact that I really didn't have a very good understanding of what was going on with all the different rules and the hoops that we needed to jump through. And it's ironic, I realized, that somebody who writes lead for a living would look at the other end of the spectrum and sort of question it all. But maybe that's more inherent in personality than is anything else. But we're planning. There was only really one instance, and it wasn't a direct impact. There was really only one instance where the preservation aspects of what we did and then the green building aspects of what we did collided. It was obliquely, and it was really kind of a misunderstanding and a misapplication on my part. But the patience that was shown in relation to the next time that I showed up in the offices, because we got the house, baby. We're going to close next week.
Congratulations.
Next time, so the patience that they showed, it was like a learning experience, because depending on what way you look at it, you can view the green building movement as kind of a sibling or a child of a lot of the preservation stuff that already happened, and I think that the integration is the key. Gail Lindsay, who was one of the giants in our history, USGBC's history, who passed away a couple of years ago, used to use the term both and I think that that's appropriate here. I would beg your patience as preservationists to sort of guide us and help us and teach us, but at the same time, I'd ask that you sort of help us, reflect the best aspects of what we both bring to the table. I tend to think that USGBC as an organization and LEED as a rating system is at its best when we're thinking about the fact that one day we won't need it, right? One day we can just sort of fade away and go open a restaurant and it'll be great. You guys have to be around, preservationists have to be around for the long term. You guys are here for it. This is a long game for you. Obviously the trajectory of when that arc of when we don't need LEED anymore is maybe a little bit longer than I'd like it to be. I'm certainly feeling the pinch on a bunch of stuff, but I think that we're, like I said, we're at our best when USGBC is operating to put itself out of business. And if you can just tolerate the mild annoyance of us here and learn what we can and learn together, I think that's going to be a healthy balance going forward.
Wow. I don't know if I can offer any more platitudes, but I guess quality matters. Good building practices matter, and those are certainly things that you can learn from, strategies that have stood the test of time, and they certainly speak to the tenets of sustainability. So we're doing it together here.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all very much.